Imagine this. You're walking through one of the richest marketplaces in the world. Gold is everywhere. Silver coins, silk fabrics, jewels, ivory from Africa, silk from China, precious stones from Persia. In a marketplace overflowing with such wealth, anyone would assume that gold was the most valuable thing there. But they would be wrong, because the most valuable thing in that market wasn't gold, it wasn't silver, and it certainly wasn't diamonds. It was something small enough to fit in the palm of your hand. A simple black spice. Black pepper. Yes, the very same black pepper that sits quietly in our kitchens today, the one we casually sprinkle over our food without giving it a second thought, was once worth more than gold. People crossed oceans to obtain it. Kings spent fortunes trying to control it. Thousands lost their lives because of it. Empires were built. Wars were fought. And without anyone realizing it, the foundations of the modern global world were being laid. So how did such a tiny spice end up changing the course of history? Why were people willing to travel thousands of miles just to obtain it? And perhaps the most fascinating question of all, how did the same spice that costs just a few dollars today become more valuable than gold? This is one of history's most fascinating and almost forgotten stories. Was a spice really worth crossing the world for? To understand the story of black pepper, we first have to forget everything about the modern world. Because today, we see black pepper as something completely ordinary. We walk into a grocery store, pick it up from the shelf, drop it into our shopping cart, and by the time we reach the checkout, most of us don't even bother looking at the price. But 1,000 years ago, people looked at black pepper the way we look at our smartphones today. Everyone wanted it, but only a fortunate few could actually afford it. So why? After all, it was just a spice. It wasn't a life-saving medicine. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't gold. So why were people willing to travel thousands of miles just to obtain it? The answer lies in the way people lived back then. Today, when you buy meat, you simply put it in the refrigerator. It stays fresh for days, sometimes even weeks. But in the Middle Ages, there was no such luxury. No electricity, no refrigeration, no freezers. The moment an animal was slaughtered, the clock started ticking, especially during the summer. Meat spoiled incredibly fast. People tried to preserve it by salting it, drying it, or smoking it, but every one of those methods changed its taste completely. And that's exactly where spices entered the story. Cinnamon, cloves, ginger, nutmeg, all of them were valuable, but one spice stood above all the rest. Black pepper, not only because it made food taste better, but because it became a symbol of wealth. Imagine hosting a lavish dinner. You serve a simple piece of roasted meat. No one is impressed. But then, you generously sprinkle black pepper over the meal. Suddenly, your guests look at you differently, because those tiny black grains quietly announced your wealth. Some nobles even locked their pepper away in chests, just as they locked away their gold, because it was valuable enough to be stolen. Today, that sounds almost ridiculous, locking up a spice. But back then, it was perfectly normal. In some cities, rent could be paid in pepper. Some merchants settled their debts with sacks of pepper. Historical records even show that certain taxes were paid with peppercorns. By this point, black pepper was no longer just a seasoning. It had become a form of currency. But believe it or not, that's still not the most fascinating part. Because the truth is, black pepper wasn't actually rare. Quite the opposite. In one particular part of the world, it grew so abundantly that local farmers considered it just another ordinary crop. So how did a plant that was almost commonplace in India become as valuable as gold by the time it reached Europe? Well, that's where the real story begins. Black pepper's journey across thousands of miles. Today, you can order almost anything from anywhere in the world, and within a few days, it arrives right at your doorstep. Shipping companies, container ships, cargo planes, massive logistics networks, they all exist to make that happen. But 1,000 years ago, getting a single product from one side of the world to the other was nothing short of a miracle. And black pepper's journey was exactly that. It all began along a narrow stretch of coastline in southwestern India. Today, we know this region as the Malabar Coast. Fertile land nourished by the monsoon rains. A warm tropical climate. Almost the perfect environment for growing black pepper. For generations, the farmers there lived the same way. They planted the vines, harvested the peppercorns, and sold sacks of them to local merchants. To them, Black pepper was no more extraordinary than wheat or tea is to us today. But the moment those sacks left the village, everything changed. Their value began to rise. First, they were transported to coastal ports. There, Indian merchants purchased the harvest. The pepper was then loaded onto ships, using the seasonal monsoon winds. Those ships crossed the Arabian Sea, sailing toward the ports of present-day Oman, Yemen, and the Persian Gulf. But that wasn't the end of the journey. In fact, it was only the beginning. The sacks were unloaded from the ships, loaded onto camel caravans, and sent across endless desert routes. Scorching heat during the day, freezing temperatures at night, sandstorms, thirst, bandit attacks. Every journey was a gamble. Some caravans never reached their destination. A single sandstorm could wipe out months of hard work in just a few hours. Other times, raiders ambushed the caravans, and the entire shipment disappeared. Every successful journey made black pepper even more expensive. Then another merchant bought it, adding his own profit. Then another, and another. Every border meant new taxes. Every port charged new fees. Every stage of transportation added another layer to the price. Just imagine, a single handful of pepper passed through hundreds of hands. Farmers, dock workers, ship captains, sailors, merchants, camel drivers, tax collectors, warehouse owners, middlemen, and finally, the merchant who sold it in Europe. Every single person earned money from the very same sack of pepper. That's why, by the time black pepper finally arrived in Europe, it was no longer just another agricultural product. It had become a luxury. But here's the truly fascinating part. The most powerful people in this entire trade network were not the Indian farmers, nor the people who actually grew the pepper. The greatest fortunes were made by those who controlled the route, because throughout history, the people who become the wealthiest are rarely those who produce the product. They're the ones who control who gets access to it. And during the Middle Ages, there was one group that held that power: the Arab merchants. They weren't simply selling pepper. They controlled Europe's entire gateway to the East. For centuries, no one believed their monopoly could ever be broken. But somewhere in Europe, a new idea was quietly beginning to take shape. A plan that wouldn't just transform the spice trade. It would change the course of world history forever. The monopoly that changed the world. If you control something, you make money. But if you control the one thing that people desperately need, you build fortunes. That's exactly what happened throughout the Middle Ages. Europe's wealthy merchants, its kings, its nobles, they all wanted spices, especially black pepper. But none of them could buy it directly, because standing between Europe and the East was an invisible wall: the Arab merchants. For centuries, they controlled the trade routes of the Indian Ocean. The spices harvested in India were first shipped to Arab ports, then carried through the Red Sea, across the Persian Gulf, and finally through Egypt and the Levant, before reaching the Mediterranean. At every step of that journey, the same thing happened. The price went up, again and again, until eventually, by the time black pepper reached Europe, it had become almost as valuable as gold. But the Arab merchants weren't simply trading spices. They were controlling information. Today, we can open the internet and see almost any place on Earth within seconds. But back then, knowledge was one of the most valuable commodities in the world. Very few people knew where spices actually came from. In fact, many of the stories circulating throughout Europe sound like fairy tales today. Some believed black pepper grew in valleys guarded by giant serpents. Others claimed its forests were protected by enormous birds. Some even insisted that anyone who tried to reach the source would never return alive. Most of those stories weren't true, but that wasn't the point. What mattered was that people believed them, because as long as fear existed, very few would dare search for the real source. And so, the Arab merchants maintained their monopoly. But Europe had another problem. In 1453, Constantinople fell. That event wasn't simply the fall of a city. For centuries, many of Europe's most important trade routes had passed through that region. Now, those routes had become more difficult, more expensive, and far less reliable. Europe's connection with the East was becoming increasingly complicated. The price of spices rose once again. Kings grew frustrated. Merchants watched their profits disappear. And everywhere, people began asking the same question: why do we keep paying everyone else? Why don't we sail directly to the source of the spices ourselves? At first, the idea sounded completely insane. After all, no one truly knew how vast Africa really was. No one knew what lay beyond the endless ocean. Many sailors believed that venturing into unknown waters was a death sentence. Violent storms, starvation, thirst, pirates, disease. Every voyage could become your last. It was one of the most dangerous professions in the world. But sometimes, there is something even stronger than fear. Money, and the wealth flowing through the spice trade, was beyond imagination. A single ship filled with black pepper could make its investors incredibly rich. Sometimes, one successful voyage was enough to secure a family's fortune for generations. And that is precisely why a small kingdom on the western edge of Europe decided to take the greatest gamble in its history. Its territory was small, its army was modest, but its ambition was greater than anyone else's. That kingdom was Portugal, and very soon, the fleet it would send across the oceans would transform far more than the spice trade. It would redraw the world's maps, give birth to new empires, and change the course of human history forever. Today, you walk into a grocery store. You pick up a small pepper grinder from the shelf. You probably don't even look at the price. You head to the checkout, pay for it, and a few minutes later, you go on with your day, without giving it a second thought. Yet those tiny black peppercorns in your hand were once a treasure pursued by the most powerful kings on earth. Ships were built for them. Ports were founded because of them. New trade routes were discovered. Oceans were crossed. Thousands of people left their homes in search of them. Many never returned. Black pepper was never just a spice that added flavor to food. It was an invisible force that helped shape some of humanity's greatest discoveries. Because people weren't really chasing spices. They were chasing greater wealth, greater power, and the promise of a better future. But perhaps the most fascinating part of this story is that no one set out to change the world. The Portuguese weren't trying to discover new continents. Merchants weren't trying to create globalization. Sailors had no idea they were laying the foundations of the modern global economy. They were simply searching for a shorter route to black pepper. Yet sometimes, the events that reshape history don't begin with grand ambitions. They begin with small goals. And that one small goal led people across seas no one had dared to cross before. It inspired the discovery of new lands. It gave rise to powerful trading empires. And for the very first time, it connected distant civilizations across the globe. The global economy we live in today may have begun with humanity's pursuit of a handful of tiny black peppercorns. So the next time you sprinkle a little black pepper onto your meal, don't see it as just another spice, because the tiny grains in your hand were once worth more than gold, and perhaps they were one of the smallest things that changed the world. Thank you for watching this far. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications. See you in another video.